greater depth as we talk about this in class. All right, next up are tests. Tests are when you set up some kind of performance that you're going to ask an individual to complete, and then you compare that individual's performance to the norms of a large population. And so when tests are standardized, they actually work really, really well in comparing that individual to a larger group. It gives you a great basis of comparison. There are different types of tests. The main two types of tests that we use in psychology would be intellectual tests and personality tests. Intellectual tests can be broken down into achievement tests and aptitude tests. Achievement tests you're very familiar with. They're the tests that you take in school all the time. Achievement tests, you learn a certain amount of information, and then we check how much you have achieved. How much do you know? Most of the final exams and SATs and so forth and so on are all achievement tests. Aptitude tests are supposed to show your aptitude, your ability at doing a particular task in the future. There used to be more and more aptitude tests that we used in society. It seems like we've reverted more to achievement tests in recent years. But for example, the IQ test, which is still used, is supposed to show your aptitude, your ability to learn. It's not supposed to show how much you actually know at any given point. And that's why your aptitude for learning, your IQ, should be fairly stable over the course of your lifetime. It doesn't change all that much. Personality tests are very, very different. You can see to the right side of the slide there, that's an ink blot. The Rorschach ink blot test would be an example of a projective personality test. The projective personality test is where the individual looks at a stimulus or listens to a stimulus, and on first blink reaction decides how much that stimulus, on first blink reaction, they say what is on their mind. So if I look at this and I say Martian, that would probably fall into the general normal category. But if someone looks at that and says something really bizarre or different from the normal answers, the psychologist would sort of just make a note of that and see if that's actually an example of a projection from their subconscious. And through psychoanalysis, may be able to make some conclusions about issues that are present in that individual. The other type of personality tests are objective personality tests, and they're really good for, they're just a simple paper and pencil personality tests, and they're really good at identifying traits that should be fairly stable for an individual over the course of their lives. And again, the tests are a piece of data. It's just one piece of data that you might use in looking for differences for an individual to the norms. The advantages of tests are obviously that they provide a great basis of comparison for an individual. And if the test has been properly standardized, it should be a pretty accurate measure of that individual. The disadvantages are that it's tough to make a quality test. And there's often issues with things like cultural bias in the wording of questions. And for some reasons, social psychologists and social scientists tend to want to use the results of test scores to compare groups to the general population. And that's generally not how tests are actually designed to work. And because of the wide range of individuals within a group, it can really throw off averages and can cause those conclusions to be highly skewed. And the research biases are definitely at play all over the place in different tests. Okay, that brings us to TOES, the O, observations. And there's two types here. You can see this picture of this person sitting back eating an apple and making some observations of what she's seeing in front of her. If you were just making observations and not changing or influencing the environment in any way, that's called a naturalistic observation. And we probably most commonly see that in animal studies, where really you don't change the environment at all. You just simply observe what's going on. You could do that with people as well. If you're observing teenage habits at a shopping mall, you could probably sit back and observe what habits you're seeing. The difficulty becomes in being really careful not to let the researcher's bias influence the data that they're collecting in their observations. So if I look at teenagers at a shopping mall and I say they're goofy, they're silly, I'm making judgment calls there, as opposed to, writing down the actual non-biased, non-judgmental observation of, teenager was giggling, teenager punched friend in the arm, teenager tried to trip one another. Now that's actually just saying exactly what's going on. You could infer that they were being silly, but you don't want to do that as the actual collector of the data, as the actual experimenter. The other type of observations are directed observations, and these observations are when you actually impose some variable on the environment. So you influence them in some way. So maybe now you want to understand how teenagers respond to people dressed in gorilla suits at shopping malls. And so you have a person dressed in a gorilla suit, and then you have them go and try to interact with teenagers, and you make those observations. So the directed observation obviously allows you to sort of manipulate the environment or control the environment in a way that will help you collect data in a more precise way. The advantages, of course, for observations are that they're good for exploring directly observable behaviors and situations. If that's what you're interested in studying, they're good there. They're also good when you're really just trying to gather general data on behavior and you don't necessarily have a really clear or specific expectation. You're just kind of curious. So this is often done early in the exploration of a psychological phenomenon. The disadvantages are that while they minimize the Hawthorne effect, they can maximize the Rosenthal effect. It's really difficult for the researcher to be non-biased and non-judgmental. And I think if you practice this, you'd realize that as well. The conclusions are often limited to the specific sample that you were looking at and the specific environment that you were observing them in. It can be difficult to project the behaviors of all teenagers at shopping malls where there's a interaction with a person in a gorilla suit if I saw it at the Natick collection. And then for me to draw conclusions that that's how kids in Texas at a shopping mall would behave, you're in a difficult position there where that may or may not work out the way that you would want it to. All right, the second E in ICE-TOES is not actually a research method in and of itself. It's just ethics. We've already discussed ethics, but just as a reminder here, really, because I needed something to fit into the mnemonic, ethics are important. They have to be considered throughout all research design. So for all of these, for every one of the ICE-TOES and all of the methods that we're talking about here today, you're going to have to account for ethics and the ethical guidelines that we've discussed in class. So just a reminder, when you're considering which of the methods you want to employ, you have to be thinking about the ethics as well. Okay, so the survey method, you've done surveys. I'm sure that you understand what surveys are. Surveys are obviously just questionnaires about specific topics, and they are great for getting information about attitudes and beliefs and opinions from a very large population in a very short period of time, because you can get them out to a lot of people. They don't take long to do. So in that sense, they're really valuable there. Where surveys can run into some problems is, again, with the wording of things. Oftentimes, surveys may have phrasing that leads people to certain answers, and that's a real problem. Also, you have to be extremely careful with your listing and naming your target population, your sample population, and sample selection process. If I was doing a survey of attitudes of seniors in high school, or seniors at Needham High School, let's just be even more specific. And then basically I just sample or conduct surveys with people just in this class. Well, this is a pretty good representation, but it's not going to project out to the entire high school senior class necessarily. You need to have a much more specific way of collecting that sample. And we'll talk about that a little bit more closely in class. Okay, so these are the different methods that you want to be able to employ. Please look over the objectives one more time. Make sure that you're comfortable, especially with 3 and 4. 3 you can practice out now before you come to class, and be prepared for me to throw something at you in class with number 4.